I was there that day, the day when a single act of courage changed thousands of lives. You probably wouldn't believe me if I told you that one of America's most successful immigration support programs started because of a skinny 12-year-old kid with holes in his shoes and determination in his eyes. But it did, and I witnessed every second of it. Have you ever seen someone stand up when everyone else stays seated? When everyone else looks away? I'm not talking about standing up in an auditorium or a classroom. I'm talking about that rare moment when someone stands up for what's right, even when they have every reason not to, even when they have nothing. That's what I saw Mason Richards do on that ordinary Tuesday at Lincoln Middle School in Westport, Connecticut. A boy from the poorest family in a wealthy district, facing down the school's most feared bully to defend a classmate who barely spoke English. What happened next silenced an entire cafeteria and caught the attention of a visiting state representative who would change everything. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to the beginning. Mason Richards wasn't the kind of kid you'd expect to make headlines or change policy. At 12 years old, he was small for his age, with a mop of unruly brown hair that hung in his eyes because he couldn't afford regular haircuts. His clothes were always clean. His mother made sure of that. But they were visibly worn, often too big or too small, clearly secondhand or handed down from his older cousins. Lincoln Middle School sat in the heart of Westport, one of Connecticut's wealthiest communities, where median home prices hovered around $2 million. The school hallways were filled with kids wearing designer clothes, carrying the latest tech, discussing summer homes and European vacations. And then there was Mason, whose single mother worked 3 jobs: morning shifts at the local diner, evening janitorial work at an office building, and weekend home care for elderly residents. They lived in a small 1-bedroom apartment on the edge of the district, only able to attend Lincoln because his mom had fought hard to stay within the school boundaries, believing education was Mason's ticket to a better life. I was Mason's social studies teacher, Ms. Hernandez. I noticed him from day one, not because he caused trouble, but because he didn't. In a classroom full of boisterous preteens competing for attention, Mason was quietly focused. He completed every assignment, often turning in papers that showed remarkable insight for a child his age. Yet he rarely spoke up in class discussions, seeming to shrink into himself whenever attention turned his way. This wasn't because Mason lacked opinions or intelligence. It was a protective mechanism. When you have the wrong clothes, the wrong address, and none of the material possessions your peers take for granted, you learn to become invisible. It's safer that way. So when Amir Kazemi joined our class in October, I saw something shift in Mason's expression. Amir and his family had recently arrived from Iran. His father, once a respected engineer in Tehran, had been forced to flee due to political persecution. Now they were starting over in America, struggling with language, culture shock, and the complicated immigration system that kept their status uncertain. Amir knew very little English. He sat rigidly at his desk that first day, his dark eyes wide with anxiety, clutching a worn English Farsi dictionary. The teacher's aide assigned to help him couldn't be present all day, and many of the students quickly lost patience trying to communicate with him. But Mason didn't lose patience. During lunch that first day, when Amir sat alone at the end of a table, Mason quietly moved his tray over and sat next to him. I was on lunch duty, so I witnessed this small gesture. Mason didn't make a big show of it. He simply nodded at Amir and started eating. Amir nodded back, relief washing over his features. The lunchroom at Lincoln was like most middle school cafeterias, a carefully calibrated social ecosystem where status was everything. The popular kids claimed the center tables, athletes clustered near the windows. The academically gifted had their corner, and those who didn't fit into clear categories found spaces at the margins. Mason had always eaten alone or with a few other kids from similar economic backgrounds. By choosing to sit with Amir, he risked drawing attention. But maybe Mason understood something that took me years of teaching to learn. Sometimes the invisible recognize each other. Over the next few weeks, I noticed Mason and Amir developing a friendship that transcended their language barrier. Mason would point to objects and slowly pronounce their names in English. Amir would teach Mason the Farsi words in return. They created their own impromptu language lessons during lunch periods. Mason shared his worn copy of the latest Rick Riordan novel, showing Amir how to follow along with the English text. Amir showed Mason photos of Iran on the library computer during study hall. Beautiful gardens in Isfahan, the mountains near Tehran where his family used to vacation. Their friendship might have continued this way, quiet and unremarkable if not for Trevor Blackwell. Trevor was an 8th grader, the son of a hedge fund manager. At 13, he already stood nearly 6 feet tall and had the confident swagger of someone who had never been told no. His father's donations had funded the school's new gymnasium, a fact Trevor mentioned frequently. He was handsome, athletic, and terrifying to anyone smaller or weaker, which included most of the student body. Trevor had a small entourage of followers who laughed at his jokes and participated in his bullying, but most did so out of self-preservation rather than genuine admiration. Better to be in Trevor's orbit than in his crosshairs. Mason had managed to stay beneath Trevor's notice for most of the year, but Amir, with his accented English and foreign mannerisms, was like a beacon for Trevor's particular brand of cruelty. It started with small things, deliberately bumping into Amir in the hallway, mocking his pronunciation, knocking books from his hands. Typical bully behavior, easily dismissed by adults as kids being kids. But it escalated quickly. Trevor began calling Amir terrorist and bomber. He made explosion sounds whenever Amir walked by. He told other students not to talk to him because he might blow up the school. These weren't just childish taunts. They were deeply rooted in post-9/11 xenophobia that still persisted in many American communities. The teachers who overheard these comments reprimanded Trevor, of course. He received detentions, had meetings with the principal. His parents were called. But Trevor's father was an important man in town, a generous donor to the school, and somehow the punishments never seemed proportionate to the offense. Trevor would be subdued for a day or two before starting again, more careful this time to make his comments when adults weren't in earshot. Through all this, Mason watched. He never participated, but he also never intervened. I could see the conflict on his face whenever he witnessed Trevor's bullying, a desire to help warring with the instinct for self-preservation. What could a small, poor 7th grader do against a wealthy, physically imposing 8th grader with connections? Mason had enough challenges already. I wish I could say that I, as an educator, found a way to stop the bullying definitively. But school systems are imperfect and teachers' powers are limited. I reported incidents. I scheduled discussions about diversity and inclusion. I kept Amir close during my monitoring periods, but I couldn't be everywhere. The day everything changed started like any other. It was Tuesday, November 15th, an ordinary day made slightly less ordinary by the scheduled visit of Connecticut State Representative David Morales. He was touring schools in his district, part of a planned educational initiative he was developing for the next legislative session. Our principal was eager to showcase Lincoln's achievements and had arranged for Rep. Morales to observe classes, tour facilities, and join students for lunch to hear their perspectives. Rep. Morales wasn't particularly well known outside political circles. At 42, he was younger than many of his colleagues in the state legislature. The son of Puerto Rican immigrants, he had won his seat on a platform focused on education reform and community development. He was considered a rising star in state politics, though not yet a household name. His visit that morning had gone smoothly. He observed an engaging science experiment in the lab, watched a rehearsal of the school band, and nodded approvingly during a presentation about Lincoln's standardized test scores, which were among the highest in the state. Now it was lunch period and Rep. Morales was sitting at a table with the principal, the school board president, and 2 honor roll students carefully selected to represent the school's best and brightest. I was on lunch monitoring duty again, standing near the service line when I noticed Trevor and his friends approaching the table where Mason and Amir sat. The cafeteria was noisy, as middle school cafeterias always are, a cacophony of voices, laughter, and the clatter of trays and utensils. But even with all that background noise, Trevor made sure he could be heard. "Well, if it isn't the terrorist and his poor little friend," Trevor said, loud enough that nearby tables fell quiet. "Are you planning which part of the school to blow up first?" Amir stared down at his food, his shoulders hunched as if trying to make himself smaller. Mason looked up, then back down quickly, his face flushing red. I started moving toward them immediately, but I was on the opposite side of the cafeteria, threading my way through tables and students. "Hey, I'm talking to you," Trevor continued, leaning down and flicking Amir's milk carton so that it spilled across his lunch tray. Don't you know it's rude to ignore people in America? Or maybe they don't teach manners in terrorist school. Several students at nearby tables laughed nervously. Others looked uncomfortable, but remained silent. At the administration table, the adults continued their conversation, unaware of what was happening several tables away. I was still making my way across the room when I saw Mason's expression change. Something shifted in his eyes, a decision being made. Trevor had moved on to mimicking Amir's accent, mangling Farsi words that he had overheard. Durka Durka Jihad, he was saying, an offensive gibberish meant to mock a language he didn't understand. His friends snickered behind him. That's when Mason stood up. He wasn't impressive physically. His second-hand jeans were too short, revealing mismatched socks. His sweatshirt was faded from too many washings. He was nearly a foot shorter than Trevor, but he stood up. "Stop it," he said. His voice wasn't loud, but it was clear and steady in a way that cut through the cafeteria noise. Several more tables fell silent. Trevor looked genuinely surprised for a moment, then amused. "What did you say, poor boy?" "I said stop it," Mason repeated louder this time. "His name is Amir. He's from Iran, not wherever you think terrorists come from. His dad was an engineer. They had to leave because people like you were in charge over there." The cafeteria was growing quieter. I had stopped moving, sensing that my intervention might prevent something important from happening. Trevor's face darkened. "People like me? What's that supposed to mean? People who think they're better than everyone else," Mason said. "People who make others feel small because they're different." Trevor stepped closer, using his height to loom over Mason. "You want to know who's small? You are, with your dollar store clothes and free lunch. At least I can afford to eat." This was the moment when most kids would back down, when the risk would seem too great, the potential for humiliation too high. I wouldn't have blamed Mason if he had sat back down and let it go, but he didn't. "Yeah, I'm poor," Mason said, his voice growing stronger. "My mom works 3 jobs, and sometimes we still can't pay all our bills. But she taught me that what matters is how you treat people." He gestured to Amir. "His family lost everything. Their home, their friends, their whole country. And you think it's funny to make him feel worse?" The cafeteria was completely silent now. Even the adults at the administrative table had noticed, their conversation trailing off as they turned to look. Trevor seemed thrown off balance by Mason's refusal to be intimidated. "You're defending this kid? You don't even know him." "I know he's my friend," Mason said simply. "I know he helps his mom cook dinner for his little sisters every night. I know he was the top math student at his school in Tehran. I know he misses his grandparents so much he cries sometimes when he thinks no one's looking." Mason took a deep breath. "And I know he doesn't deserve to be treated like this." Trevor's face flushed with anger. "Sit down and mind your own business before..." "Before what?" Mason interrupted. "Before you hit me? Go ahead. Everyone will see, including him." He nodded toward the administration table, where Reverend Morales was now watching intently. Trevor noticed the state representative for the first time, and uncertainty flickered across his face. "You know what the difference is between Amir and you?" Mason continued. "Amir is going to do something important someday. He's smart and kind, and he works hard. But you?" Mason shook his head. "You're just going to be another rich guy who peaks in middle school." There was a collective intake of breath from the students watching. No one spoke to Trevor Blackwell this way. No one. Trevor's hands curled into fists at his sides. For a moment I thought he might actually throw a punch. State representative or no state representative. I started moving again, determined to intervene before things escalated to violence. But Trevor didn't throw a punch. Instead, he did something worse. "At least I have a father who wanted me," he hissed. It was a direct hit. Mason's father had abandoned the family when Mason was just 3 years old, leaving his mother to raise him alone. It wasn't common knowledge, but rumors spread quickly in small communities. I saw the blow land in the way Mason's body seemed to absorb it, a slight flinch that he couldn't control. Pain flashed across his face before he could mask it. For a moment, it seemed like Trevor had won, had found the one thing that would make Mason back down. But Mason straightened his shoulders and looked directly into Trevor's eyes. "My mom chose to keep me and raised me by herself even though it was hard," he said, his voice quieter but still steady. She works from 5 a.m. to 9 p.m. most days so I can have opportunities. She teaches me to stand up for people who need help. His gaze was unwavering. I'd rather have one parent who teaches me that than two who raise a bully. In that moment, Mason wasn't just standing up for Amir. He was standing up for himself, for his mother, for every kid who had ever felt less than because of their economic circumstances. The silence in the cafeteria was absolute. Even the kitchen staff had stopped working to watch. Trevor stood frozen, his face cycling through emotions: anger, embarrassment, uncertainty. His friends had taken small steps back, suddenly less eager to be associated with him. The spell was broken by the sound of slow, deliberate clapping. Representative Morales had stood up. He was applauding, his expression both solemn and impressed. After a moment, another student joined in, then another. Within seconds, most of the cafeteria was applauding, not loudly or enthusiastically, but with a steady rhythm that acknowledged something important had happened. Trevor looked around, suddenly aware that he had lost whatever power he'd held over this situation. His face contorted with humiliation. "Whatever," he muttered. "You're both losers." He turned and stalked away, his friends trailing after him with uncertain glances back at the continuing applause. As the noise subsided, I finally reached Mason and Amir's table. Mason had sat back down, looking slightly dazed, as if he couldn't quite believe what he had just done. "Are you okay?" I asked both boys. Amir nodded, his eyes wide with admiration as he looked at Mason. Mason nodded too. "I think so." His hands were shaking slightly, the adrenaline beginning to ebb. "What you did was very brave," I told him. "But if he threatens you again, or if anyone gives you trouble about this, I want you to tell me immediately. Understand?" Mason nodded again, but I could see in his expression that the impact of his actions hadn't fully registered yet. He had acted on instinct, on principle, without calculating consequences. I was about to suggest they finish their lunch when I noticed Representative Morales approaching our table. The principal was following him, looking both concerned about the incident and anxious about how it might reflect on the school. "Young man," Representative Morales said directly to Mason, "may I join you?" Mason looked startled but nodded, sliding over to make room on the bench. Representative Morales sat down, ignoring the principal's attempt to steer him back to the administrative table. "My name is David Morales," he said, extending his hand to Mason. "I'm a state representative." Mason shook his hand tentatively. "I'm Mason Richards. And you are?" Representative Morales turned to Amir. "Amir Kazemi," Amir said quietly, his accent thick but understandable. "Well, Mason and Amir, I was supposed to be here today to learn about educational programs," Representative Morales said, "but I think I just witnessed a more important lesson than anything on my agenda." He looked directly at Mason. "That took tremendous courage." Mason looked down at his tray. "I just said what was true." "Truth often requires courage," Representative Morales said, "especially when speaking it might cost you something." He glanced around the cafeteria, which had mostly returned to its normal volume, though many students were still watching their table with interest. "May I ask how long you've been friends?" "Since Amir came here in October," Mason said. Then with a small smile at Amir, he added, "We're both kind of outsiders." "Outsiders often see things more clearly," Rep Morales replied. "Amir, how long has your family been in the United States?" 3 months, Amir answered. We came for political asylum." "And how has the transition been?" Amir hesitated, looking at Mason. "It's okay," Mason encouraged. "You can tell him." "It is difficult," Amir said carefully. "My father was engineer in Tehran. Here, he drives taxi. My mother was teacher. Here she cannot work because our status is not finalized." He struggled to find the words. "We are grateful to be safe, but starting again is hard." Representative Morales nodded thoughtfully. "I understand that. My parents came from Puerto Rico when I was very young. While Puerto Ricans are American citizens, the cultural adjustment was still challenging." He turned back to Mason. "And you mentioned your mother works 3 jobs?" Mason nodded, a flash of defensiveness crossing his face. "She works really hard. I have no doubt of that," Representative Morales said, "and I'd like to hear more about both your experiences. Would you be willing to talk with me for a few more minutes? With Ms. Hernandez present, of course," he added, nodding to me. I quickly agreed, and the principal, after a moment of hesitation, excused himself to oversee the rest of the lunch period. I suspected he was relieved to step away from a situation that highlighted bullying issues that the administration had failed to resolve. For the next 20 minutes, as students finished lunch and moved on to recess or study hall, Reppers Morales listened intently as Mason and Amir talked about their lives. Mason described the economic challenges his family faced, despite his mother's constant work. Amir explained the complexities of the asylum process, the language barriers, and the culture shock his family was experiencing. What struck me most was how articulate both boys became once they felt truly heard. Mason, usually so quiet in class, spoke with passion about his mother's determination to keep him in a good school district despite the financial strain. Amir, struggling with English, nevertheless conveyed the pain of leaving friends and extended family behind, and the difficulties of rebuilding a life in a new country. As the lunch period ended, Reppers Morales thanked them both for their honesty. He handed them each a business card. "If either of you ever need anything or if things get difficult with that other student, please have your parents contact my office." He looked at them seriously. "What I saw today matters to me. You both matter." The boys nodded, looking slightly overwhelmed by the attention. As they headed to their next classes, Reppers Morales turned to me. "Those are exceptional young men," he said. "They are," I agreed. "And they both face challenges that no child should have to deal with." He nodded thoughtfully. "I've been working on an education initiative, but I'm seeing now that it may need to be broader in scope." He paused. "Would you be willing to put me in touch with their families, and perhaps provide some insight into other students facing similar situations?" "Of course," I said. "Anything that might help." As Reppers Morales left the school that day, I had no way of knowing that this incident, a brief moment of courage from a 12-year-old boy, would become the catalyst for one of the most comprehensive immigrant support programs in our state's history. The immediate aftermath of the cafeteria confrontation was mixed. Mason became something of a minor celebrity at school for a few weeks. Students who had never spoken to him before suddenly wanted to sit with him at lunch or partner with him for projects. Mason seemed uncomfortable with the attention, though he handled it with the same quiet dignity he showed in everything else. Trevor Blackwell received a week's suspension, not just for this incident but for the pattern of bullying that could no longer be ignored once it had been so publicly displayed. When he returned, he gave Mason and Amir a wide berth. His social status had taken a significant hit, though he still had his core group of friends. Middle school social hierarchies are remarkably resilient. Amir's English improved rapidly with the increased social interaction that came from his association with Mason. More students made efforts to include him, whether out of genuine interest or a desire to be seen doing the right thing. Either way, his days of eating lunch alone were over, but the most significant changes happened beyond the school walls. 2 weeks after the incident, Mason's mother received a call from Rep. Morales' office inviting her and Mason to meet with him. Amir's family received a similar call. Both families were hesitant at first, unused to attention from government officials and unsure what to expect. The meeting took place on a Saturday afternoon at the local library, a neutral, accessible location that wouldn't intimidate either family. I was invited to attend as well, both as an educator and as someone familiar with the boys' situations. Lisa Richards, Mason's mother, arrived directly from her morning shift at the diner, still wearing her waitress uniform. She was a petite woman with the same unruly brown hair as her son, though hers was pulled back in a practical ponytail. Despite visible exhaustion, her eyes were sharp and attentive, especially when it came to Mason. The Kazemi family arrived together: Amir's father Reza, mother Fatima, and his 2 younger sisters, ages 7 and 5. They were all immaculately dressed as if for a formal occasion, revealing the middle-class background they had left behind in Iran. Reppers Morales greeted everyone warmly and explained why he had asked them to meet. "What I witnessed in that cafeteria," he said, "made me realize that we're failing to support families like yours, hardworking Americans struggling to make ends meet, and new immigrants trying to rebuild their lives. I've been developing an educational initiative, but I see now that education doesn't exist in a vacuum. Children can't learn effectively when their families are in crisis." He outlined a vision for a more comprehensive program, one that would address not just educational needs but economic stability, immigrant integration, and community support, and he wanted their input. "I don't want to create policy from an ivory tower," he explained. "I want to hear directly from the people who will be affected by it. What would have made your lives easier? What supports do you need most? What barriers have you encountered that lawmakers might not be aware of?" What followed was a 3-hour conversation that covered everything from affordable housing to healthcare access, from ESL programs to job retraining, from childcare costs to the complexities of the immigration system. Lisa Richards described the impossible mathematics of her life, how her 3 jobs barely covered rent in the school district, how any unexpected expense could topple their precarious stability, how she lived in constant fear that Mason would need braces or break an arm or outgrow his winter coat before she had saved enough for a new one. "I don't want handouts," she emphasized. "I've worked my whole life, but the system seems designed to keep people like us from ever getting ahead." Reza Kazemi spoke of the psychological impact of status loss. From respected professional in his home country to taxi driver in America, unable to use his engineering skills because his credentials weren't recognized, and recertification would take years they couldn't afford. "We are grateful to be safe," he echoed his son's words from earlier. "But it is difficult to be invisible, to have your knowledge and experience count for nothing." Fatima Kazemi, a former literature teacher, described her frustration at being unable to work while their asylum case was processed, and her fear that by the time she was permitted to seek employment, her teaching skills would be considered outdated. "I want to contribute," she said simply, "to our family and to America, but I am not allowed." Throughout the conversation, Mason and Amir added their perspectives as well. The social challenges at school, the pressure they felt to hide their family's struggles, the small indignities that accumulated over time. Reverend Morales took copious notes, asked thoughtful questions, and shared some of his own family's immigrant experience. By the end of the meeting, he had outlined the framework for what would eventually become the Connecticut Opportunity and Integration Initiative, a comprehensive program designed to address the interconnected challenges facing both working-class American families and immigrant households. "This is just the beginning of the conversation," he told them as the meeting concluded. "I'll be speaking with many more families and experts. But you've given me invaluable insights, and I'd like to keep consulting with you as this initiative develops." As we left the library that day, I remember Lisa Richards turning to me with tears in her eyes. "No one's ever asked us what we need before," she said quietly. "They just tell us what we can and can't have." Over the next 6 months, Reverend Morales made good on his promise. He conducted dozens of similar listening sessions across the state. He consulted with economists, educators, immigration attorneys, and social workers. He visited community centers, churches, and schools in neighborhoods ranging from affluent suburbs to struggling urban areas. He also stayed in regular contact with the Richards and Kazemi families, occasionally visiting them at home to get a first-hand understanding of their daily realities. These weren't photo opportunities. He never brought press along or publicized these visits. They were genuine efforts to ground his policy work in real human experience. By the following summer, Reverend Morales had drafted the Connecticut Opportunity and Integration Initiative, COI. The proposed program was ambitious in scope, addressing multiple interconnected issues. 1. Educational support that extended beyond schools to include family literacy programs, expanded ESL classes for both children and adults, and credential recognition pathways for immigrants with professional backgrounds. 2. Economic stability measures including job training programs, small business support, affordable housing initiatives, and childcare subsidies for working parents. 3. Immigration integration services providing legal assistance, language acquisition support, cultural orientation, and community connection programs. 4. Community building efforts designed to bridge divides between established residents and newcomers, creating mentorship opportunities and cultural exchange programs. The bill faced opposition, of course. Some criticized it as too expensive, others as too ambitious in scope. There were those who objected on ideological grounds, arguing against providing support to non-citizens or expanding government programs generally. But Rep. Morales had done something politically savvy. He had built a coalition that transcended typical partisan divides. By addressing the needs of both working-class American families and immigrants, he created a program that appealed to multiple constituencies. He emphasized economic development and self-sufficiency rather than dependency, which brought more conservative lawmakers on board. And he had gathered so much real-world testimony from affected families that it was difficult for opponents to dismiss the need. When it came time for the bill to be presented to the state legislature, Representative Morales invited Mason and Amir, along with their families, to attend the session. They sat in the gallery as he introduced the legislation. In his opening remarks, Representative Morales did something unexpected. He told the story of what he had witnessed in Lincoln Middle School's cafeteria that November day. This initiative began because a 12-year-old boy with holes in his shoes stood up to defend a classmate, he told the assembly. He showed more courage and moral clarity than many adults I know. And when I spoke with him afterward, I realized that our policies were failing both of them. One whose family has been in America for generations, the other newly arrived, but both facing obstacles that no child should have to navigate. He gestured to where Mason and Amir sat in the gallery. These young men and thousands like them across our state aren't asking for special treatment. They're asking for a fair chance to build their lives, to contribute to their communities, to reach their potential. This initiative is designed to provide that chance. The Connecticut Opportunity and Integration Initiative passed with bipartisan support, though in a somewhat modified form that reduced its overall budget. It was signed into law in September of the following year and implemented in phases over the next 2 years. The program wasn't perfect. No government initiative ever is, but its impact was substantial. In its first 5 years, QI helped over 15,000 Connecticut families achieve greater economic stability. It supported more than 3,000 immigrants in obtaining professional recertification in their fields. It funded ESL programs that served 22,000 adults and children. It facilitated the creation of over 400 small businesses through microloans and entrepreneurship training. For the Richards family, the program provided childcare subsidies that allowed Lisa to consolidate her 3 part-time jobs into 1 full-time position with benefits. It connected her with a career development program that helped her train as a medical office administrator, doubling her previous income. And it provided academic support and college counseling for Mason, opening pathways that had once seemed impossibly out of reach. For the Kazemi family, QII provided legal assistance that expedited their asylum process and helped Reza navigate the engineering recertification requirements. It funded an intensive ESL program for Fatima that enabled her to eventually qualify for a teaching position, and it connected them with community mentors who helped them navigate American systems and culture while honoring their Iranian heritage. The program became a model for similar initiatives in other states, including Oregon, Minnesota, and Illinois. Policy experts studied its interdisciplinary approach and its emphasis on integration rather than just assistance. But perhaps the most meaningful impact wasn't captured in statistics or policy papers. It was in the lives of 2 boys who had once been outsiders in their school cafeteria. Mason Richards graduated from high school with honors and received a full scholarship to UConn. He majored in social work with a minor in public policy, inspired by his first-hand experience with how policy decisions affect real lives. After college, he joined a nonprofit that helps working-class families navigate government systems and access available resources, the same types of resources that had helped his own family advance. Amir Kazemi also thrived academically, eventually studying engineering like his father, but his passion for languages led him to develop translation technology designed to help immigrants and refugees communicate more effectively in healthcare, legal, and educational settings. The app he created has been implemented in hospitals and community centers across New England. The 2 remained friends throughout high school, college, and beyond, an unlikely bond forged in a middle school cafeteria that changed not only their lives but thousands of others. Representative David Morales went on to serve 3 more terms in the state legislature before being elected to the U.S. House of Representatives, where he continued to advocate for policies supporting both working families and immigrants. He often credits his political trajectory to what he witnessed that day at Lincoln Middle School, a reminder that courage can emerge from unexpected places, and that sometimes the most powerful policy inspirations come not from think tanks or campaign strategists, but from the simple moral clarity of a child. As for Trevor Blackwell, I wish I could report a dramatic transformation. the bully who saw the error of his ways and became an advocate for inclusion. Reality is rarely so neat. Trevor completed middle and high school without any notable incidents or achievements. He attended a mid-tier college on his father's connections, and eventually went to work for his father's firm. By all accounts, he became an unremarkable adult, neither particularly destructive nor particularly contributive. Mason's prediction that he would peak in middle school proved more accurate than anyone could have anticipated. I left teaching after 15 years in the classroom, eventually taking a position with the State Department of Education, where I helped implement the educational components of COII across Connecticut schools. I've seen firsthand how the program has transformed opportunities for thousands of students like Mason and Amir. Sometimes I think about that ordinary Tuesday in November, how none of us could have predicted the ripple effects of one small act of courage. How a boy with nothing to his name but his principles changed policy that changed lives. I think about it whenever I hear people dismiss children as just kids, or when I encounter the cynical belief that individual actions don't matter in the face of systemic problems. I think about Mason Richards standing up in that cafeteria, his voice quiet but unwavering, and I remember that systems are changed by people, sometimes very young people, who refuse to accept that things must remain as they are. I was there that day. I saw courage in its purest form, and I've spent the years since watching how far its echoes can travel. So the next time you wonder if standing up matters, if speaking truth to power makes any difference, if one person can really change anything, remember this story. Remember Mason Richards with his second-hand clothes and his first-rate character. Remember that sometimes the smallest voices carry the furthest. And if you ever find yourself in a position to stand up when others remain seated, to speak when others stay silent, remember that you never know who might be watching, whose life might be changed, what movements might begin with that single act of courage. I've seen it happen. I've watched it unfold, and I can tell you that courage is contagious. When Mason stood up that day, he didn't just defend Amir. He showed everyone in that cafeteria what was possible. He reminded them, reminded all of us, that we always have a choice, that even when we feel powerless we aren't, that our voice matters. In the weeks following the incident, I noticed subtle changes throughout the school. Students who had previously looked away when they witnessed bullying began to speak up. Not dramatically, not heroically, just small comments like, "That's not cool," or "Leave them alone." Small ripples from Mason's stone in the pond. The teachers, too, became more vigilant, more willing to address the uncomfortable topics of economic inequality and cultural differences in their classrooms. We had always considered Lincoln a good school, and by many metrics it was. But Mason's stand forced us to confront the ways we had failed some of our most vulnerable students, the blind spots in our supposedly inclusive community. Principal Adkins, to his credit, implemented new anti-bullying programs and cultural sensitivity training. Though I suspect this was partly motivated by fear of negative publicity after a state representative witnessed bullying in his school, the effect was still positive. Sometimes progress comes even when the motivations aren't entirely pure. The most meaningful changes, though, weren't institutional. They were personal. Lisa Richards, Mason's mother, told me months later that something had shifted in her son after that day. "He stands taller," she said during a parent-teacher conference. "He doesn't try to make himself invisible anymore." Fatima Kazemi noticed similar changes in Amir. "He is finding his voice," she told me, her own English improving rapidly. Not just the English words, but his confidence to use them. This is what happens when someone believes in you, when someone stands beside you. It doesn't erase all hardships or solve all problems, but it creates a foundation from which growth becomes possible. Reverend Morales understood this when he designed COI to provide not just material support, but connection and community. Resources matter enormously. Adequate housing, healthcare, education, income, but so does belonging, being seen, having allies who recognize your humanity. That's what Mason did for Amir in that cafeteria. He saw him, not as a foreigner, not as an ESL student, not as a political asylum case, but as a friend, a whole person with dreams and fears and dignity. And in doing so, he forced everyone else to see him that way too. I've thought often about what gave Mason the courage to act that day. He had every reason to stay silent. He was already vulnerable, economically, socially, with his own difficult circumstances to navigate. Adding Trevor's wrath to his problems would have been the last thing most children in his position would choose. When I finally asked him, months later, his answer was simple. "My mom always says that what you have doesn't determine who you are," he told me. "We might not have much money, but we can still be the kind of people who do the right thing." That moral clarity, that separation of worth from wealth, of character from circumstances, had been Mason's North Star. In a school where status was often measured by possessions, in a town where worth was often equated with wealth, Mason had been given a different value system, and that made all the difference. I wonder sometimes where courage like that comes from. Is it innate, a quality some people are simply born with? Is it taught, passed down from parent to child through words and example? Is it forged through hardship, the way pressure creates diamonds from coal? Perhaps it's all of these. Perhaps it's something else entirely. What I do know is that courage, real courage, is rarely loud or showy. It doesn't announce itself with grand gestures or stirring speeches. More often it's quiet, understated, a simple refusal to look away when it would be easier not to see, a decision to speak when silence would be safer. Most of us will never face dramatic tests of courage, rushing into burning buildings or standing before tanks in public squares. But we all face the small daily choices to stand up or stay seated, to speak or remain silent, to acknowledge injustice or pretend we don't see it. It's easy to dismiss these moments as insignificant, to tell ourselves that one person can't change a system, that speaking up won't make a difference. Mason Richards proves otherwise. One boy in a school cafeteria, with holes in his shoes and determination in his eyes, changed the trajectory of thousands of lives. Not because he set out to be a catalyst for policy change, he couldn't have imagined such an outcome, but because he made the simple, difficult choice to do what he believed was right in a single moment. Connecticut's Opportunity and Integration Initiative has now been replicated in 7 states, with federal legislation based on its framework currently moving through Congress. Its annual budget exceeds $50 million. It employs hundreds of people and serves tens of thousands. All because a 12-year-old boy refused to watch his friend be bullied. I'm not suggesting that every act of everyday courage will launch a policy revolution or change state law. Most won't. But that doesn't make them any less necessary, any less transformative for the lives they do touch. After the COII had been operating successfully for about 3 years, Representative Morales organized a small ceremony to commemorate its achievements and recognize some of the people who had inspired its creation. The event wasn't heavily publicized, just a gathering at the state capitol with program participants, administrators, and a few key supporters. Mason and Amir, now high school sophomores, attended with their families. They had both grown taller, their voices deeper, but they still had the same essential quality I had recognized in them as middle schoolers, a thoughtfulness, a seriousness of purpose that set them apart from many of their peers. Near the end of the ceremony, Representative Morales presented them each with a framed copy of the original COII legislation, with their names mentioned in the preamble. It read, in part, "Inspired by the courage of young Connecticut residents who demonstrate that mutual support transcends differences of background, origin, or economic circumstance. This legislation seeks to create pathways to opportunity and meaningful integration for all families, striving to build secure and dignified lives in our state." It wasn't until that moment, I think, that Mason fully understood the impact of what he had set in motion. As Representative Morales handed him the framed document, I saw tears in his eyes, not of sadness or even joy exactly, but of wonder. The realization that his single act of standing up had created something that would outlast him, that would help people he would never meet. Amir, standing beside him, placed a hand on his friend's shoulder, a gesture that perfectly mirrored Mason's decision to sit beside him that first day in the cafeteria. A circle completed. There's a plaque now in the hallway of Lincoln Middle School. It doesn't mention Mason or Amir by name. That was never the point, and neither of them would have wanted that kind of recognition. Instead, it simply reads, "Courage is not always loud. Sometimes it's a quiet voice at the end of the day saying, 'I will try again tomorrow.' But sometimes it's a quiet voice in a crowded room saying, 'This isn't right.'" Both kinds of courage are born of the same source, the belief that our actions matter, that our voices count, that our humanity is shared. Students pass by it every day, most without giving it much thought. But occasionally I hear that a teacher will use it as a discussion prompt, asking students to consider what courage means to them when they've witnessed it, how they might cultivate it in themselves. And sometimes I'm told, a student will ask about the story behind the plaque, and the story is told again, how a boy with nothing to his name but his principles stood up in a cafeteria and changed the course of countless lives. It's been almost 10 years since that day. Mason Richards is now completing his master's degree in social policy at Georgetown. Amir Kazemi is working for a tech company while developing his translation app with the support of a major innovation grant. Their families, once struggling to survive, are stable and thriving. Reverend Morales, now Congressman Morales, continues to champion legislation inspired by what he witnessed that day. The Connecticut Opportunity and Integration Initiative continues to evolve, adapting to new challenges and needs, helping new generations of families find their footing and their voice. And I continue to tell this story, not just because I was there to witness it, not just because I want to honor Mason's courage and Amir's resilience, but because I believe we all need reminders that change is possible, that systems can be improved, that individual actions matter. In a world that often feels overwhelmingly complex, where problems seem too big and solutions too distant, the story of Mason Richards in that middle school cafeteria is a necessary reminder that history turns on small moments as well as large ones, that policy can be shaped by principles as well as politics, that the moral courage of a child can sometimes accomplish what the combined efforts of many adults cannot. I was there that day. I saw it begin, and I've had the privilege of watching it unfold over years, expanding beyond anything we could have imagined, touching lives far removed from that school cafeteria. So when people ask me if I believe individuals can change systems, if small actions can address big problems, if standing up matters when the odds seem stacked against you, I tell them this story. I tell them about Mason Richards and his second-hand clothes and his first-rate character. I tell them about Amir Kazemi and his courage in building a new life in a strange land. I tell them about Lisa Richards working 3 jobs and still teaching her son that character matters more than circumstance. I tell them about Representative David Morales, who recognized that good policy begins with listening to the people it aims to serve. And then I tell them about the thousands of families whose lives have been transformed because one boy refused to remain seated when he saw injustice, because one boy believed that his voice mattered, even when every social cue told him it didn't. That's the thing about courage. It doesn't always wear a cape or make headlines. Sometimes it wears scuffed shoes and a too small sweatshirt. Sometimes it speaks with a wavering voice that grows stronger with each word. Sometimes it looks like a boy standing up in a school cafeteria saying simply, "Stop it. His name is Amir." And sometimes that's enough to change everything. I know, because I was there. I saw it happen. And I've spent every day since then trying to be worthy of what I witnessed. The quiet, transformative power of one person choosing to do what's right, even when it isn't easy. Especially when it isn't easy. So if you take anything from this story, let it be this. Your voice matters. Your courage counts. Your actions ripple outward in ways you cannot predict and may never fully know. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes, a single moment of standing up when others remain seated can change not just one life, but thousands. I've seen it happen. I know it's true. And now, so do you. Take a deep breath and hit that like button if this story moved you. Subscribe to never miss another story of hidden courage and unexpected impact. Comment below with a time when you witnessed someone stand up for what was right, even when it was difficult. And share this with someone who needs to be reminded that their voice matters, that small actions can create big changes, that courage is always worth it, even when the outcome isn't guaranteed. Because the truth is, none of us knows which of our actions might be the stone that creates ripples far beyond our sight. None of us knows when our moment to stand up might change everything.